Symon is the secretary of the Psychedelic Society, a very important organisation you should all look up if you have not already. He's also a keen mycologist. So I'll give him the stage now. Thank you, Symon.
Thanks, Ronnie. So I'm just going to talk about some general approaches that can be helpful when you're thinking about maybe having a psychedelic experience. I think these are helpful to think about if you're considering your first psychedelic experience, or if you've already had some before, especially if the ones before maybe didn't go so well, and in terms of thinking about how potentially you can reduce the risk of harms. There is a lot of buzz and a lot of hype about psychedelics in the community, and I think it's easy to get the impression that perhaps they are essentially devoid of any risk. I certainly don't think they are. Sure, when they're approached safely and sensibly, the risks are probably quite low for most people. But it's important in terms of how you approach them. Probably predicts a lot of the outcome and the chances of whether you're going to have a really positive or a really difficult experience, as well as some of the other, I suppose, more serious acute things that can just go wrong if you enter these sorts of states without thinking through what it's going to be like, where you're doing it, and all this sort of stuff. So. To start with, as a disclaimer, psychedelics are obviously illegal across the board in Australia, so not condoning their use, but I think it's important that if you are going to do it anyway, you do it in a way that is as safe as possible, recognising that with any substance you imbibe, it's impossible to make them completely safe. And the sort of format I like to use when I'm talking about this is a who, what, where, when and how type approach. The broader literature about psychedelics tends to talk about set and setting, but I think unless you've read a lot about what those actually mean, it's quite difficult to put that into action and plan around it. So I think, hopefully this is a helpful model in terms of preparing for and thinking about psychedelic experiences. I don't think this is going to take an hour, so I will chip in and try and get some feedback. Everyone who's been around, seen or taken psychedelics will probably have their own insights into aspects of safety when using them. So it's great to hear from other people as well. The who component of this is thinking about both who should or shouldn't take psychedelics, but also who you might think about taking them with or who you might think about not taking them with. From the perspective of who should take psychedelics, again, really difficult to sort of make any specific recommendations around that. All we can say is that there's quite a large body of evidence showing that for people even outside of clinical settings, when approached safely, psychedelics can have some pretty profound psychological benefits. There's far more published literature doing surveys of people who've taken psychedelics on their own and reporting the potential benefits for them than there is giving them to people in clinical situations to try and treat specific conditions. That is a relatively new body of modern evidence compared to the significant, there's survey data covering thousands of people who've taken psychedelics and asking them what the experience was like and what they got out of it. So there's a lot to turn to suggest and support the idea that these can be really beneficial experiences for a wide range of people when done sensibly. The caveat to that is that there are probably people, in fact, from my perspective, there are definitely people who shouldn't take psychedelics. Psychedelics can really induce psychotic states. If you are someone who has had psychotic experiences in the past, you are probably at a greater risk of having them again in the future. And if you are someone who lives with a psychotic spectrum illness, that's schizophrenia and potentially bipolar disorder, although there is some more research going on with psychedelics in that condition now, the risk is probably quite significant that it may exacerbate the psychotic experiences that you're already living with. So there's probably a lot more risk involved in those situations. In terms of thinking about who you might take psychedelics with or who you might not take psychedelics with, important to remember that while you're under the influence of a psychedelic drug, you are going to be in a more vulnerable state of mind. That vulnerability comes in a few forms. Both you will be more emotionally vulnerable because you are going to be a little bit raw, some of your defences are going to be a little bit chopped off. You're also potentially going to be thinking about really difficult experiences that you've had in your life and really reflecting on aspects of yourself, aspects of your past, aspects of your relationships that can it can be really emotionally challenging. It can be a really, really raw experience to have those things come up without the filters that we usually have applied in our normal conscious state. Having those sorts of experiences around some people might be helpful, like, close friends, people you're really secure and safe with in your relationships. Having those sorts of experiences around people that you are uncomfortable with or that you have some unresolved tension with already may be too much. You may find yourself in a very vulnerable state around people you already have some underlying discomfort being around. It's good to bear in mind because that might really influence the nature of the experience that you have with the psychedelic on board. It might take it down a much darker path than it might otherwise go down. The other thing to bear in mind is around vulnerability, that you're going to be more physically vulnerable. You may be more suggestible, you may be more influenceable, and you may also just frankly be less able to remove yourself from a really, really challenging situation. This is particularly relevant when it comes to considerations around sexual safety risks and being taken advantage of. Psychedelics and the psychedelic scene are by no means devoid of sexual violence and gender-based violence and other forms of violence, emotional violence. So I think it is important to bear that in mind as well. Taking psychedelic substances at big places like festivals, certainly there are cases where people have been victimised and been abused. So I think, again, in terms of thinking about who you might take them with, it's also important to think about who you feel comfortable with, who you know you will be safe with when you are in a more vulnerable state and less able to remove yourself from those situations, and perhaps also just less able to express your wishes, which is also important a bit later when we talk about, we'll talk about now actually, consent issues, right? Lots of people have sex on psychedelics. Informed consent in those situations is something that needs to be considered quite deeply. And that's the same with any intoxicating substance, right? If you are under the influence of something, there will be a point where you are not really capable of giving informed consent. It's important to bear that in mind when you are the one suggesting sexual activity, because the person who is receiving that request, may actually not be able to express their true wishes. And that's the same if you're getting, drunk at a pub or something. Everyone should really know, although lots of the times this line does not get respected, that if someone's absolutely off chops, even if it's what you really want, it's not on, really it's not the time. So I think we need to be respectful of the fact that psychedelics also can impair that capacity to give informed consent to sexual activity as well. There is a lot of benefit for many people, particularly if you are taking psychedelics for the purpose of some deeper exploration or some personal healing through some difficulty or some trauma, or if you're just not that familiar with them, to having a sober person present with you, someone you trust, someone you're comfortable with, who can actually just make sure things are going well. You might find yourself in a state where you can't even get up to walk to the kitchen to get yourself a glass of water when that's really what you want. Or if you need a bit of sugar, that you can't actually figure out how to get the apple and eat the apple. Having someone there who can actually help with some of those seemingly little things that can all of a sudden become very, very important when you can't do them when you need to is very, very helpful. It's particularly helpful if the person that's sitting with you has a lot of familiarity with the psychedelic experience, particularly with the substance you are taking, because they are all a little bit different. So if they know what the norm is, they can both comfort you and provide you with some reassurance that what you're experiencing is just part of the normal experience, which can help a lot when you start freaking out that what you're experiencing must mean things are going wrong and this can't be what anybody else has ever had. And also just looking up those little practicalities as you go through the experience. There are other settings where you might be taking psychedelics in large groups, and like I say, big festivals, dorks, it's quite common for people to take psychedelics. For some people that's just not the right place, and that's, I think, just being honest about it. And, some festivals are probably going to be maybe safer places to do that than others. So just thinking about what that group dynamic's going to look like, how comfortable you're going to be around large numbers of people, particularly complete strangers, and particularly strangers who might also be intoxicated with other things. How's that going to feel? what is, after 2.5 days of duk 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 going on in the background, going to feel like when you take that acid and you haven't slept properly for 2 days already. Got to sort of be quite sensible about that, because these things can go dark, and that can be a really unpleasant, potentially traumatic experience. A little note on facilitators. There is a large commercial underground of paid psychedelic facilitators who you might go to for some healing. You'll usually pay them, they'll usually give you some drugs. The approaches those facilitators take vary greatly. Some facilitators might do this one-on-one, some might have one giving potent psychedelics to 25 people in a tent in the middle of nowhere with no toilet facilities and no consideration to any of those practicalities. So you really want to think those things through. Facilitators also all have a very different style. Some of them will superimpose supposed traditional practices onto a Western context. For some people, that's the experience you're looking for, fine. For other people, that can be really uncomfortable. So you need to actually ask quite detailed questions about, what's their approach? What's this actually going to look like? Where are we doing it? What are the facilities like? How many people are going to be there? How many facilitators are there to the number of people that are going to be getting dosed? How safe and sensible is it to maybe have 1 or 2 facilitators dosing a whole room of people? How much attention can they actually pay you in those situations? What happens if one of those people starts to absolutely freak out and have a very, very difficult experience? And how does that influence the experience of everyone else that's there? Are there enough facilitators there to actually take control of those situations and ensure people's safety? The Patch is another organisation in Australia that have released a very, very helpful book called How to Be Psychedelically Aware that covers a lot of that. The Australian Psychedelic Society also have a guide on our website looking at some red flags when you're looking at facilitators and how to choose a psychedelic support person, is what it's called. Fees also vary, so if you're paying lots of money and expecting a particular experience, you want to make sure it's going to be safe, you want to make sure you're actually getting what you are needing and what you are wanting. The next sort of thing is the what. The first part of the what is, what are you actually taking, and how do you know that's what you're actually taking? That is simpler with some things than it is with others. Natural products in their raw form, okay, that's a cactus. I can tell that's a cactus. I know the species of that cactus. I know it's got mescaline in it. Pretty straightforward. Increasingly, when it comes to synthetic chemicals or extracts, there is a lot of adulteration of drug supply, and there is more and more adulteration of drug supply in Australia. Particularly with what's called novel psychoactive substances, which is things that are relatively new. There is just an ever-expanding list of designer drugs that are primarily being made to get around drug laws, particularly in other countries where they don't have the same type of laws we do here. Some of those probably have never even been given to a mouse in a lab, let alone taken by other people. Safety profiles are completely unknown, risks in certain situations completely unknown, really, really, really difficult to know that what you're going to do is going to be done safely. You don't even know what to expect out of the experience. Some of the newer synthetic phenethylamines, like the NDOMEs, that are sort of modifications of 2CB, 2CI in that class, much more likely to cause heart problems and seizures than a lot of the other drugs that, even then 2CB and stuff that they were modelled on. So they do all have very different risk profiles, and unless you are very, very clear on what you're taking, it's hard to know how to take it safely. It's also hard to dose it. The trend in synthetic drug development tends to be towards making things more and more potent, because it is a lot easier to smuggle 1 kilogram and a lot more profitable to smuggle 1 million doses in 1 kilogram of drug than 1,000 doses in 1 kilogram of drug. So unfortunately, there does sort of tend to be this trend towards potency. One particular adulterant that's worth special mention in Australia at the moment are the nitazene opioids. These are extraordinarily potent opioids that can be 100 times more potent than fentanyl, which is about 100 times more potent than morphine. So you're talking about sort of nanogram doses of drugs that can stop your breathing very, very, very easily. They've been found in Australia now in ketamine, MDMA, pills, Even black market THC vapes caused a whole bunch of overdoses down in Sydney from these nitazines, as well as heroin and the opioids, where you expect opioids at least. This means that people who may previously not have been at risk of opiate overdose are now at risk of opiate overdose, and my thought would be that basically, if you're going to take a drug in Australia at the moment, assume that you are at risk of an opiate overdose, know how to spot one, know how to respond to them, and get yourself some take-home naloxone from a local pharmacy that participates in the take-home naloxone scheme. Naloxone is a drug that is now available in a nasal spray, comes in a packet with 2 administration devices in it. If someone's had an opiate overdose, it will reverse that opiate overdose temporarily, which will stop them from dying while professional help arrives. It's easy to use and it won't harm anyone who's become unconscious for another reason, but it's always worth a try. So you need to know how to spot opiate overdose. Again, there's a guide on the Australian Psychedelic Society about the nitazines and about opiate overdose, how to spot it, how to respond to it. And take-home naloxone, I think, should just be in everyone's first aid kit, especially if you are around other people who are taking drugs. Obviously, you can't use that on yourself. And that's the other key. If you are getting a new batch of a drug, even if it's a drug from someone you trust, someone you think is reputable, trying a new batch of a new drug on your own is probably never a good idea. Taking drugs on your own is always a higher risk than taking it with other people that you trust, but certainly taking a new batch of a new drug on your own puts you at a significant risk, particularly if there were some opiates in it, like the nitazines. If you have a nitazine overdose on your own, there is nothing you can do about it. That will be the last anyone ever hears from it, which is terrible. There was a horrible case in Melbourne not that long ago where people bought what they thought was cocaine. The whole crew of them all snorted some lines of coke, and everyone had a nitazine overdose, and everyone died. They were all found, subsequently. So it's turning up in a whole bunch of different things. Similarly, if you are taking a new batch of new drugs with other people, you probably shouldn't all ingest it at exactly the same time. I know this is totally counter to the typical approach, but it's, in terms of safety, probably just not a great idea. Also, new batches of new drugs always start low and go slow. There are very few psychoactive substances where you can't take more later and still get more effect. Some of the psychedelics, that is actually difficult to do, but for the most part, safety over effect. You would rather get high safely than get too high. So start low, go slow, watch out for each other. If you're going to try something you haven't tried before, try and get familiar with the effects of that drug. Erowid is a great resource. They've got a lot of experience reports on there for the different drugs. You can go on there, you can read about what people have experienced when they've taken it before. It's also important then to understand sort of the different durations of different drugs. If you're going to take mescaline without knowing that it can last sort of 12 or 16 hours and you need to go to work the next morning and you're just taking it at 8 p.m, that's not a setup for having a great time. So know what you're at least expecting to take, and then hopefully what you are actually taking is going to be what you expect it to. Although unfortunately, increasingly, that's not always sure. There's also a lot of places you can go in the community to ask questions about, a particular substance. If you want to know about psychedelic mushrooms, go to one of the psychedelic mushroom Facebook groups and ask there. If you want to get familiar with, psychedelics in general, go to some of the Psychedelic Society meetups in the capital cities or wherever you might be, or join some of the talking circles, join some of the groups that have these sorts of conversations. People are always going to be happy to share their experience and share their wisdom, because everybody just shares the goal of other people being safe and potentially getting the most benefit out of that as they can. It is never going to be sort of frowned upon to actually just ask. Seek that community knowledge. The next thing is thinking about where you might take psychedelics. This is a really difficult one to think about from a risk management perspective, because where people generally like to take psychedelics is often places that aren't necessarily the safest, i.e. out in the middle of the bush, out camping, particularly when you're thinking about wild psychedelic mushrooms. So comfort's the number one thing probably to think about there, but safety in terms of what will you do if something doesn't go the way you are hoping it does. If everyone's off chops, tripping balls, and you are an hour away from the nearest mobile reception and you are 2 hours away from the nearest hospital, what happens if somebody breaks an ankle or gets bitten by a snake? You know, like, there's a fine balance here between preparing and going into it with the expectation that something horrible is going to happen, because that also doesn't help. But if you think about these things in advance and know that there is a plan in place to deal with them if they do happen, I think that significantly reduces the anxiety during the experience. You don't want to be an hour into a deep mushroom trip and then start thinking, oh my god, I just realised that if something bad happens, there is absolutely nothing anyone here can do about it. It is actually protective against that sort of thing happening to have a plan, be prepared, and ideally, particularly when you're out in the bush, have somebody there who's sober who can actually go for help or take you for help. Think about your responsibilities. If you've got kids, if you've got pets, if you've got work the next day, you know, factor that into what you're going to do. I know it sounds like common sense, but common sense isn't that common, so just prepare for that sort of thing as well. Taking drugs impairs your ability to do that sort of stuff. Be realistic about that. I think some people can be a little bit gung-ho, especially if they've had psychedelic experiences before, to just assume, I'll be right, I've done this before, I'll be able to handle it if I need to. Again, probably not the best preparation in mind. Thinking about similarly distractions, you know, if you're on call for work, even if you're not likely to get called, probably not the best time to be completely out of this dimension. But everyone's got their own framework around what acceptable risk is. When to take psychedelics is also an interesting one, because a lot of people these days are using psychedelics to try and get some psychological benefit, often in a difficult period in their life. The flip side to that is that taking psychedelics during a difficult period of your life probably increases the risk of a difficult experience. That doesn't mean that people can't benefit by taking that approach. It just means that you need to, I think, be a little bit more prepared and have a little bit, at least some open awareness of the fact that if you've got a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, if you're really dealing with some difficult life decisions, the risk is higher. Doesn't mean that you necessarily can't do it safely and gain out of it, but it does mean that you need to be aware that the risk is higher and think about how you're going to handle that. If stuff does start to turn dark, how are you going to try and turn that around? What are your strategies? What items of comfort do you have in your environment that usually provide you with some support, some emotional nourishment that you might be able to use in those moments to ground yourself and bring yourself back into the present moment and out of that psychedelic state? Sometimes regrounding can be a really powerful way to avoid those distressing experiences getting more and more distressing and darker as the trip goes on. Unresolved trauma is another really interesting thing, because again, a lot of people are taking psychedelics these days to try and deal with some unresolved trauma, some difficulty. Timing is probably key there. If something has just recently happened, to bring those traumas right up to the surface, the risk of it becoming a very dark experience is again probably higher. So again, if you are determined to go down that path and try and use psychedelics to get through that, you might need some preparation. You might even need to see a psychologist or an integration specialist to do a bit of preparation work so that you're feeling comfortable for it. You might need to plan out a little bit more what your grounding strategies are going to be, what your relaxation techniques that you might use during the experience to settle that down could be if that does start going down that dark path. And it again might be one of those situations where you really want a sitter with you who can actually help you navigate those difficult experiences if they get really challenging. And intention's a big one when thinking about the when to take psychedelics. What are you actually trying to get out of it? Are you just trying to have a good time, or are you trying to do some really deep personal work? Because that decision as well sort of dictates how you might go about doing it, where you might do it, with whom you might do it, and all of those other sorts of things that I've already covered. The next thing is how you might take psychedelics. All of these drugs have different ways that you can ingest them, and people get very, very creative around this. There is not an orifice that has been spared in the human body when thinking about how to imbibe in something that might get you high. The time to onset of drugs varies greatly depending on how you take them, and that depends on the drug, and it depends on how the body absorbs the drug through that different, that different membrane or wherever you put it. So it's good to actually think that through. You know, if you snort something, it's generally going to come on very, very quickly. If you eat it, it's generally going to come on a little bit slower. If you inject something, it's going to come on ultra quickly. So thinking that through. another example is something like mushrooms, right? You eat the mushrooms, it takes a little while for the body to actually pull the stuff out of the mushroom. If you already have it in a tea before you drink it, it generally comes on a lot quicker. So you've got to think about that, because if you've just rocked up at the campsite and someone's going, righto, first thing I've done while I've got here is going to pick the mushrooms, let's eat the mushrooms and then we'll set up camp. Maybe, hopefully it's warm out and dry that night, because the camp might not be as well established as you would otherwise have hoped. Particularly then if you're thinking about alright, do we put them in a tea and then take that before we set stuff up? It's going to come on quicker. So just thinking those things through. There are also specific risks associated with different routes of administration. So snorting drugs can be quite damaging to the nose, quite damaging to the mucous membranes. A lot of people will try and alleviate that to some extent by using a saline spray after snorting, so that at least the drug isn't sitting in the nose and potentially causing some further damage. Likewise, sharing notes or other snorting implements. When you snort something, you can traumatise the nose. You can actually get some blood, even if it's not visible, but some microscopic blood can end up on the implement. That is a potential transmission route for bloodborne viruses like Hep C and HIV. You shouldn't share any snorting implements, just like you wouldn't or shouldn't share injecting equipment. That does bring me on to injecting. Now, injecting in psychedelics is not common, but I think with ketamine it is quite common, particularly intramuscular injections of ketamine is quite common among the recreational sector. So that brings with it all the potential risks of injecting. You need to make sure that you're using clean equipment, you need to make sure that you're following best practices around that. And when you're injecting something, you are significantly increasing the risk of infections getting into your body from unclean product. If somebody's had their hands all over what you're just about to shoot up, that's a risk. There could be some bugs, there could be some, anything in there really. To demonstrate that this does actually happen, there was a case in America where somebody did actually inject mushroom tea. That's just at face value a really, really horrible idea, because anything that comes from nature is covered in microorganisms. And mushrooms themselves are living organisms. The spores are alive, they have the capacity to replicate. There's also a huge capacity to end up with a significant allergic reaction to some sort of component of the thing you've just injected. So, not everything is safe to inject, which again, common sense sounds like, but not that common. That person ended up in ICU with sepsis and did not have a very good outcome, which is really, really sad. And I don't think we should be dismissive or judgmental of people who do this. It's just about the importance of sharing information and really thinking these things through before you do it. A few extraneous points that aren't directly related to that, thoughts around preparing for a psychedelic experience, but legality is good to have in mind. I think some people can be very surprised to see just how severe drug penalties can be for what might on face value seem like small quantities of drugs. You can find the drug legislation for each state, and you can find the weight limit tables for different drugs, so you know what a small personal quantity is and what a trafficable quantity is and what a commercial quantity is. Also good to bear in mind that even if you only have what would on their own be considered small personal quantities of multiple different drugs, each state has a way to add those up to determine whether those multiple small personal quantities actually amount to what they consider a trafficable quantity. So maybe you've got one pill and a point of cocaine, just a few different things that on their own would probably not give you a really serious charge. If they say that you have multiple different drugs on you, there is a higher chance they're going to try and suggest that was a trafficking offence. The penalties then go up massively. The other thing is that natural substances in some states will be charged as though the weight of the entire natural product is the pure chemical that is listed in the legislation. This is a particularly big issue with mushrooms. In New South Wales, for example, all of the weight limits for mushroom-related charges are based on weight limits that were designed for pure psilocybin. Now, in a dried mushroom, psilocybin content is probably 1%. In a fresh mushroom, it's probably 1/10 of that. But you will be charged on the weight of the mushrooms as though that is all pure chemical. Those laws were designed so that people who were carrying around cut powders couldn't argue that, well, that heroin was only 5%, so I should only be charged with 5% of the weight of the powder. But it's being applied to natural substances as well. The last time I checked, 25 grams of psilocybin in New South Wales was a 20-year offence, because that was a trafficable quantity. 100 grams was a large commercial quantity which can potentially yield a sentence of life in prison. One single cubensis mushroom fresh out of the cow patty can easily weigh 50 or 100 grams. Yeah? So that means there can be an argument made that if you're found with that one mushroom, you have a large commercial quantity based on weight. That doesn't necessarily mean that once you actually get to court, that's the way it's going to be dealt with, but there have been cases of people, because you can't be bailed on those sorts of really serious drug offences. So you end up in remand, which means you spend the time waiting for trial in prison so that you can then argue to the judge that you aren't actually trafficking or carrying a commercial quantity of the drug. So there have been cases where people have spent quite a long time in remand. I know one case where somebody spent a very long time in maximum security prison on remand for, I think it was about an ounce of drug mushrooms, because that was over the commercial quantity. So good to sort of be aware of the specifics of the drug laws in the state. They are different state by state, so it's good to sort of have some familiarity. The other thing is with growing plants that contain a scheduled, like illegal substance in them, Queensland has quite different laws around the legality of just growing a plant that has an active chemical in it that's scheduled compared to most of the other states. In most states, having the plant growing, unless there is some evidence that it's being used or is intended to be used as a drug, is not usually a legal problem. In Queensland, that is not necessarily the case. Growing a cactus containing mescaline there can actually be an offence in and of itself, is my understanding. Again, not a legal expert, but good to be very familiar with your local state drug legislation. The other thing is, it's a prime area for it, but trespassing on farmland can yield very, very hefty fines from a biosecurity perspective. And trespassing and wandering around on farms without cleaning your shoes and all that sort of stuff does spread weeds, invasive species, fungi, microflora. There are invasive species of fungi that are being tracked by bushwalkers through state forests and national park that are becoming a real problem because they displace native susceptible species. So being aware of those sorts of biosecurity things helps both from a personal risk of being fined perspective, but also from an ecological standpoint. Don't trespass on farmland, basically. There's plenty of crown land where cows wander, and it's also, if you are going to want to go onto somebody's private property, go and ask permission. From what I've heard, a lot of people, when they actually do that, get surprisingly positive responses from the people they've asked. And it's not strictly about legality, but just be mindful of scams. There are a heap of scams online where people are openly sort of saying that they sell drugs. For a start, anyone that is openly advertising the sale of illegal substances in this country should be like an immediate red flag, because it might be a setup. If they are doing that, what are the chances that they get busted pretty soon, and how likely it is that they've kept your address and your purchase order and everything somewhere on a little black book? And it's more often than not actually just going to be a scam. You'll pay the person and they'll get the money, no drugs will ever come. What are you going to do about it? So, like I said, didn't think that was going to take an hour. That's basically my sort of thoughts and my little approach, who, what, when, where and how approach to planning for and preparing for a psychedelic experience. There's heaps of great resources out there. You don't need to walk that preparation journey alone. Seek out, ask people that know, ask people that have experience. It's a vibrant, thriving, helpful community within the psychedelic realm, and anyone who's involved in this will be more than happy to try and make sure that you are safe and reducing your risk of harm wherever possible, and hopefully maximising your chance of gaining some benefit out of the experience as well. Again, last note, I don't want to give the impression that it's all doom and gloom. When approached safely, most people experiencing psychedelics have generally positive experiences, and even quite negative experiences can, for most people, be turned around. But there are people who are at greater risk, and also preparation is always going to be key.
Put our hands together for science. We'll take some questions if anyone wants to put their hand up. I've got an extra long mic there. Up the back.
Mostly one, like you were saying about the innovation of the supply chain that's going on, especially when it comes to nicotine. The idea that a lot of people may not be aware of the reaction to this, especially using, for example, is susceptible to contaminants. Being able to get a simple nitazene test kit or having this on a reagent test kit. So if you are purchasing MA or those lines, even a recent point where we had some at the house, I thought, you know what, throw on the plate, let's do a reagent test. Anyway, what it showed was, yes, it was coach, but it's also the sensation of it was different, and which made me then question it, which then showed the reagent test actually showed what one of the cutting agents was, which turns out was something that I was going to no, I'll never touch this ever again. So it really opened your eyes to what is actually going on in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. For the sake of the recording of that, the question is basically about reagent test kits and testing of drugs. Ketamine's an interesting one too because it's not only just adulteration with totally weird stuff, but there's a whole bunch of ketamine analogues that are increasingly common too that can often have much longer durations of effect, even if it's a similar effect. It lasts way longer than you were expecting. It might be way more potent. So good to be aware that this is a really evolving market. But in terms of testing, yeah, there's reagent test kits that you can get that will identify, broadly speaking, some chemical classes that you might be looking to avoid. The issue with those sometimes is that they might not identify stuff that wasn't supposed to be in there unless they react with that stuff as well. You know what I mean? So like, you might find out that it is what you were hoping it was, or that it was something else that you didn't think it was that at least that test kit picks up for, but again, not a surefire thing. There's plenty of stuff that won't show up on those sorts of basic reagent tests. Nitazene test strips do exist. They're validated for some of the main chemical structural classes of nitazenes, but not all. So still worth having, still worth using. You can buy them online. But again, it's an evolving market. People are always fiddling with these molecules. So still not a guarantee, but still worth having. It is really nice to see an expansion of formal chemical drug checking programs in Australia. I forgot to mention that New South Wales Health release drug alerts whenever something bizarre is found. You can find these online. You can sort of bookmark that page. Checkpoint Queensland, they release all of their findings. Whenever they find something particularly concerning, they'll put out a notice about it on their Facebook group. But they'll also regularly put out reports in terms of what they're finding, which is helpful to be aware of. The checking services in the ACT do the same thing. Victoria's just starting their trials of drug checking, and New South Wales has now committed to starting some trials. And I think actually this might even be this weekend that they were planning to have their first drug checking trial, one of the festivals. So those places have much more sophisticated technology, much more sophisticated equipment that will test for a very, very broad range of substances. Really helpful to be aware of where to find those notices for what is being found, so that you can sort of keep a finger on the pulse around what contaminated adulterants you're more likely to come across. And again, yeah, for the nitazenes, I just think everyone really needs to know how to spot an opioid overdose these days. Everyone needs to have take-home naloxone at home, know how to use it, and know its limitations. If you ever need to use take-home naloxone on someone, you also need to call an ambulance. Naloxone doesn't last very long, it can wear off before the opioid that caused the overdose does, and often will. So just because they're woken up now doesn't mean that all things are good. You've got to get the ambulance there as well. Something I should probably keep as a critical component of this is always call an ambulance. If something just doesn't feel right, if it doesn't look right, the ambulance isn't there to get you in trouble. The ambulance doesn't care. You do need to be honest with them so that they can provide the care they need to provide. But police almost never get called, basically unless they think there's a broader risk to other people involved. The police are very unlikely to actually rock up. And bad stuff does happen, people do overdose, people do die. Just never hesitate to call an ambulance. I mean, shit, even if it's a decision between is one of us here going to cop a drug charge versus is my mate going to die here today, just call the ambulance. It's not, worry about that stuff later. It's not even a big worry, but certainly shouldn't be front of mind, right? Even as a medical professional, if someone with medical training is in a setting where people have taken drugs and something bad happens, you wouldn't ever try to manage it there. You would always still call an ambulance. You never know what that toxicodrome is actually going to turn into and what interventions are going to be required. So just never hesitate. If something doesn't feel right, get help. It's always worth it.
We got another question at all? Kane? about woodland paralysis?
Yes. So two things about taking natural drugs in their plant form. Potency varies widely. There are several species of psychoactive mushrooms in this country that are commonly used. The potency difference is enormous. Even in this area, the Psilocybe cubensis that grow in cow dung and the Paneola sinensis that grow in cow dung are massively different in potency. So you need to take the right dose for the particular mushroom that you're going to take. Likewise with cactus or acacia, if you're going to use one of those in their natural form, the potency of cactus varies hugely in terms of mescaline content. The DMT content of different acacias can vary very, very significantly, species by species, and just tree by tree as well, so it's hard to predict. When using natural products, the harm reduction advice that's usually given is to take a batch that's got multiple doses worth in it and combine it so that it's homogenized, because one mushroom can also be more potent than the next mushroom. Likewise, one piece of cactus from that plant can be more potent than one piece of cactus from that plant. Rather than you taking that one and your mate taking that one, combine the two together so that the brew is at least homogeneous. You know, the amount of active chemical in any one cup of that is going to be the same. So that's a helpful way to approach that. What Kane's mentioning is a phenomenon that we are just sort of increasingly understanding now with Psilocybe subaeruginosa and some of the wood-loving species of mushrooms that do grow in Australia. They used to be thought to be made mostly just down in the southern parts of the country, but you know, we now know they grow all the way up past Brisbane really, in temperate climates usually. They can sometimes cause a temporary paralysis that can be pretty profound, sometimes very, very, very profound, and that I think both of us, after spending a lot of time doing a survey of this and trying to get the first ever paper about it published in literature, because there is nothing about this in medical literature at all at this point, we both feel that it can probably be fatal. I certainly feel that it can be fatal in rare instances. And it can also lead to just a huge risk of personal injury and accident. We did a large survey. We had about 161 people or so who had wood-loves paralysis, described the experience in quite a lot of detail. You know, someone the next day felt like the paralysis had improved, which often happens. It feels like it's gone away, and then it comes back when you start to use the muscles again. They jumped in their car, went for a drive, and then stopped being able to use their hands. Luckily, they weren't going at high speed, and they just let the car run up onto a pavement or a bank. But that's just sheer luck, right? Someone had taken them and then gone swimming. And while they were swimming, the weakness started to set in. They just managed to get back to the beach and climb up above the waterline before they couldn't move at all. So something to be mindful of if you are going to take those mushrooms, the cold wood-loving mushrooms. It does seem like it's quite rare, considering how many people take those mushrooms, but it's common enough that it's becoming increasingly recognised. Again, just mostly in Australia we had 161 reports, and that's just people responding to a survey. We certainly see people talking about it on online forums a bit. That seems to be more prone to being localised to particular patches, so you know, again, our advice, harm reduction advice around that, if you're picking wood-loving mushrooms from a patch you haven't picked from before, and probably also for the first time you might pick from at the particular season, go extra slow and extra low on the dose just to make sure that you don't get those sorts of weakness symptoms. And if you have picked from a patch and it has caused weakness before, it's probably going to do it again even in subsequent seasons, so probably best to just write that one off and move on. If you or anyone you know does have that happen, it'd be really nice if they could add the location of the patch that had the mushrooms that caused it to our iNaturalist project, so that we can try and sort of get some idea of where this is happening. And also, again, those patches should basically be considered no-go zones. So, you know, we hear people say, oh, I don't want to put my patch online because then other people will go and pick there. So, well, the advice should be that no one should go and pick there. That's why we want it online. So, yeah, interesting phenomenon. Hopefully we'll have a paper published about that fairly soon.
Is there any, do we know the mechanisms?
No.
Or the contamination or other?
I don't think it's contamination. I think it's probably a genetic difference in mushrooms in particular patches.
Yeah,
maybe
it's an alkaloid.
Yeah, whether it's an alkaloid or something else, probably is an alkaloid. There's some theories around what might be causing it, but really early days. And like I say, there's not even anything published in the medical literature about this existing. When we talked to some clinical toxicologists at the very start of wanting to do the research, the response from one of them was, can't exist, I haven't heard of it. Oh, well, a lot of people are saying that it has happened. So, you know.
And when did this become aware in the community? How long has it been a sort of phenomenon?
So the first published paper we could find that gives a pretty convincing case report of this was from Japan in like 1973. So it's not new. The first reports of it in some other, just not the focus of a paper, but there was a case series from New Zealand in the 90s that had some reports of this, and we talked to the people that wrote that, and they said they actually saw quite a lot of it there in the 90s.
This is just in the subs?
Not just subs. Subs and their relatives. Interestingly, the species from Japan that caused it is not that closely related to the section subregionose either. So, but they all seem to be lignicolous species, like wood-loving species. Yeah.
But the main data you've had over the last couple of years, isn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, we did our survey collection I think like 4 years ago or 3 years ago. But four. Yeah. Wow. Okay. But again, that's sort of a cross-sectional survey. So there's reports of this on shroomery and stuff dating back quite a while. Some of those reports were referencing discussions of it on earlier forums. I think it's been known about in the community for quite a long time. I think one of the things that stopped it from being further explored was that a lot of people sort of interpreted this as like obviously there comes a point where you ingest enough mushrooms that it is hard to move no matter what the mushrooms were. This is very different. This is actually a very physical weakness that can come on within half an hour. Most commonly, like about half the cases come on within the first 2 hours. But some people don't notice the weakness until the next day for the first time. So it's got this really weird pharmacokinetic profile in terms of time to onset. Most people recover within 24, 48 hours. For some people it's out to like 72 hours, there'll be a bit of residual weakness. No lasting harms that we've heard of or had reported, aside from the risk of accident injury. And I think the mechanism for it potentially being fatal would be that it would shut down your respiratory muscles at some point. They tend to go last with muscle paralysis because they're the most highly preserved. But there's been a few cases where there was a death immediately after some of these symptoms being present. You know, autopsies and stuff don't tend to find that much evidence around primary respiratory arrest, so hard for them to draw connections. But at least 2 deaths where someone had had these symptoms beforehand and then subsequently died without another explanation found. So put 2 and 2 together there, I think.